The fact that they were seen visually and by radar is the most convincing combination of evidence. That is a direct quote from a declassified UK Ministry of Defence file. Document reference, UK MOD, DFE 24-2034, page 1. The person who wrote that sentence was a senior RAF analyst. The year was 1956, and the event they were describing lasted over 5 hours.
Hold on. Visual confirmation and radar at the same time. Because last episode, the Washington, D.C. incident, 1952, that was radar only. Controllers saw the blips, scrambled the jets, and then the objects vanished before pilots could get eyes on them. That was maddening enough. But now you're telling me there's a case where they actually saw it, with their own eyes, while the radar was tracking it.
Not one radar installation, multiple. Ground radar at 2 separate bases, and airborne radar in the cockpit of a fighter jet actively pursuing the object. And the pilot did not just see it on his instruments, he saw it out the canopy. He described it, he chased it, and then something happened that he could not explain, and that the RAF could not explain either, and that no one has fully explained in the 67 years since.
Okay, so that's the question we're answering today. Is there a gold standard case? Because every time this subject comes up, skeptics say the same thing. Show me one incident with multiple independent witnesses, ground radar, airborne radar, and a visual confirmation all happening simultaneously. One case that checks every box. We've been building toward this. Episode 1, we looked at the Air Force's own internal debate about whether these things were real. Episode 2, Washington, D.C., radar confirmation but no visual lock. Today we find out if the gold standard actually exists. And to help us work through this, I want to bring in Dr. Sarah Walsh. She's an aerospace physicist. Her work focuses on atmospheric phenomena and the physics of flight at extreme velocities. Dr. Walsh, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. And I want to be upfront about where I'm coming from, because I think it matters. I am a skeptic by training and by habit. When someone describes an object moving at impossible speeds, my first instinct is to reach for an explanation. Atmospheric lensing, radar anomalies, misidentified aircraft. That's not stubbornness, that's methodology. You eliminate the explainable before you take the unexplainable seriously. What drew me to the Lakenheath case specifically is that I tried very hard to apply that methodology, and I kept running into a wall.
That's a fascinating thing to hear from a physicist. What do you mean, a wall?
I mean that the data is internally consistent across independent systems. When you have one radar operator seeing something strange, you can question the equipment, the operator's fatigue, the atmospheric conditions. When you have 3 separate radar systems, ground-based units at 2 different bases, and an airborne set in a pursuing aircraft, all tracking the same object, performing the same maneuvers simultaneously, and you have a pilot visually confirming what the radar is showing, the standard explanations start to buckle. Not collapse entirely, but buckle. And that's when a case gets scientifically interesting.
So by the end of this episode, what should our listeners be able to say? What's the takeaway if we do our job right?
They should be able to evaluate the evidence themselves, not take my word for it, not take the RAF's word for it. Understand what radar can and cannot tell you, understand what visual confirmation adds to that picture, and then look at what happened over England on the night of August 13, 1956, and make a reasoned judgment. That's all I'd ask of anyone.
That is the right framing, and the documents we are going to examine today are not summaries or second-hand accounts. They are the primary records, the original RAF intelligence files, the formal investigation reports, and a Ministry of Defense analysis that was classified for decades. When we are finished, the listener will have seen the actual evidentiary record, not a journalist's interpretation of it.
All right, let's go back. August 1956, Cold War England. Set the scene for me. What's the world looking like at this moment?
The Cold War is at one of its most paranoid peaks. The Soviet Union tested its first hydrogen bomb in 1953. By 1956, both superpowers have intercontinental delivery systems in development. Every radar operator in Western Europe is on hair-trigger alert, because an unidentified blip on a screen is not an academic question. It could be the beginning of a nuclear strike. The RAF and USAF are sharing bases in England under NATO arrangements, and the air defense network is sophisticated and heavily staffed. These are not tired technicians on overnight shifts. These are trained professionals whose entire job is to identify what is in the sky.
So when someone at one of these stations sees something they can't identify, the stakes are enormous. It's not a curiosity. It's a potential act of war.
Exactly. Which is why the documentation is so thorough. Every unusual contact gets logged, reported up the chain, and investigated. The Cold War surveillance apparatus, which was built to catch Soviet incursions, ended up creating the most detailed record we have of these anomalous events. The military infrastructure designed to track enemies was also tracking something else, something that nobody had a good explanation for.
The two bases at the center of this incident are RAF Lakenheath and RAF Bentwaters, both located in Suffolk, in the east of England. In 1956, both are joint RAF and USAF installations. Bentwaters is home to the 81st Fighter Interceptor Wing of the United States Air Force. Lakenheath hosts a mix of RAF and USAF personnel. These are active combat bases, not administrative outposts. The radar equipment at both installations is military-grade, continuously monitored and regularly calibrated.
And this isn't the first time something unusual has been reported in British airspace. There's a whole context here that most people don't know about.
That context matters enormously. In the years leading up to August 1956, the British government had already been grappling with this question at the highest levels. In 1950, Prime Minister Clement Attlee's government received questions in Parliament about flying saucers. The response was to commission a formal study. That study, completed in 1951, was produced by a group called the Flying Saucer Working Party, a committee of senior intelligence and scientific officials tasked with evaluating the evidence. Their findings, and the document that contains them, are going to become very important later in this episode.
The Flying Saucer Working Party, that's a real government committee with a real report.
A classified one, produced in 1952, marked secret, and not released to the public for decades. We will come back to it. For now, what matters is that by 1956, the British government had already taken an official position on this subject. The question is whether the events of August 13th forced them to reconsider it.
And that's the historical tension that makes this case so significant. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It lands on top of an existing official conclusion, and the data either confirms that conclusion or it doesn't. From a scientific standpoint, that's the ideal test. You have a hypothesis, and then you have an event that either supports or challenges it. What happened at Lakenheath and Bentwaters is, in my view, a genuine challenge to the official hypothesis.
Okay, so walk me through the night. August 13th, 1956. What time does this start, and who's involved first?
It starts in the early evening, around 9:30 p.m. local time, and it runs until roughly 3:30 in the morning. That's 6 hours of documented activity. It begins with radar operators at Bentwaters picking up an unusual contact. A single object moving at a speed that doesn't match any known aircraft in the inventory. Not Soviet, not American, not British. The initial speed estimates from radar put it somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 miles per hour. For reference, the fastest operational aircraft in 1956 was the English Electric Canberra, with a top speed of around 580 miles per hour. We're talking about something moving 5 to 7 times faster.
5 to 7 times faster than the fastest plane they had in 1956.
And that's the conservative estimate. Some of the radar track data suggests even higher velocities. Now, I want to be careful here. Radar speed calculations in 1956 are not GPS precise. There's room for error. But even if you discount the readings by half, you're still looking at performance that no known aircraft could achieve. And that's before you get to the maneuverability, which is where the data becomes genuinely difficult to explain.
The maneuverability, what are we talking about?
Instantaneous direction changes. No deceleration curve, no banking arc, no turn radius. In physics terms, any object with mass that changes direction must experience acceleration. And at those speeds, the g-forces required would be incompatible with any known material structure, let alone a human pilot. A conventional aircraft making a sharp turn at 500 miles per hour might pull 5 or 6 Gs. A turn at these recorded speeds, if the radar data is accurate, would require hundreds of Gs. That's not a number we build aircraft around. That's a number that destroys aircraft.
So either the radar is wrong, or the physics of what's being tracked are outside anything we know how to build.
Those are the two options, and I've spent a lot of time on the first one, trying to find the radar error that explains this. The problem is that the error would have to occur simultaneously, in the same way, across multiple independent systems. The probability of that starts to become its own kind of improbability.
There is also a human element to this story that grounds it in something beyond instrument readings. The key witness on the ground is a USAF Master Sergeant named Forrest Perkins, the watch supervisor at Lakenheath Ground Control Approach Radar that night. Perkins was a senior, experienced operator. When the first contacts came in from Bentwaters, he confirmed them independently on his own equipment. He is the man who made the call to scramble the RAF interceptors. His account, provided to investigators years later, is detailed, consistent, and has never been formally challenged.
Forrest Perkins. A master sergeant, a watch supervisor. This is not a junior airman who got spooked by something on a screen. This is the senior man in the room.
He had been doing this job for years. He knew what weather returns looked like on radar, what aircraft transponders produced, what electronic interference looked like. His testimony, and the official logs from that night, described something that did not match any of those known signatures. He tracked the object as it decelerated from high speed to a complete stop, hovering according to the radar, and then accelerated again instantly. That sequence, stop and start with no transition curve, is what convinced him this was not a malfunction.
The hovering element is actually as significant as the speed, from a physics standpoint. An object moving at several thousand miles per hour that comes to a dead stop, not a gradual stop, an instantaneous stop, and then hovers and then reaccelerates, is doing something that no propulsion system we have ever built can do. Jet engines, rockets, even theoretical scramjets, they all require a transition period. They have inertia. Whatever Perkins was tracking on that radar screen either had a way to cancel inertia or the radar data is wrong. And the radar data was confirmed by multiple systems.
And then they scrambled the jets.
They did. And that is where this case moves from a radar anomaly into something else entirely. Because when the RAF de Havilland Venom fighter, a twin-boom jet interceptor, the frontline aircraft of the day, got airborne and the pilot turned on his own radar and looked for the object that Perkins had been tracking from the ground, he found it. Immediately, on his airborne radar, and then he looked out the canopy and he saw it with his eyes. That is the moment this case becomes what the RAF analysts later called the most convincing combination of evidence.
That's the quote from the cold open, and we haven't even gotten to the documents yet. That quote, written by a senior RAF analyst, based on what he was reading in the classified files, that's the conclusion of someone who reviewed everything we're about to go through. I want to know how he got there. Let's get into the documents.
Before we get into the documents, let me orient the listener. We have been building toward this case for 2 episodes now. In episode 2, we looked at the 1952 Washington, D.C. radar incidents. Objects tracked over the Capitol, fighter jets scrambled, radar operators and pilots confirming the same things in real time. The thread we left hanging was this: what happens when the technology gets better? The witnesses are more qualified, and the encounter lasts not minutes but hours. That is Lakenheath-Bentwaters, 1956, and the paper trail that followed it is extraordinary.
Right, and I want to remind listeners, last time we ended with that question about radar phantoms versus solid objects. The DC sightings, as remarkable as they were, had that asterisk hanging over them. Temperature inversions, atmospheric ducting, the possibility that radar was seeing something it wasn't equipped to interpret correctly. The critics had ammunition, so the question going into today is whether Lakenheath removes that ammunition. Whether this is the case that closes the door on the easy explanations.
And from a physics standpoint, that framing is exactly right. The skeptical explanations for radar anomalies, temperature inversions, ground clutter, equipment malfunction, they are legitimate. They happen. But each of those explanations makes a specific prediction. If it is a temperature inversion, you will not get corroborating visual confirmation. If it is equipment malfunction, you will not get corroboration from a second independent radar station. Lakenheath is interesting precisely because it keeps eliminating the easy exits. Every time you try to close a door, another data point holds it open.
The first document I want to walk through is UK Ministry of Defence File DEFI 24-2034-1. This is an unclassified MOD parliamentary correspondence file, dated 15th of October 2001, running to 339 pages. What it contains are official written answers to parliamentary questions submitted by Lord Hill Norton. That is, Admiral of the Fleet, Peter Hill Norton, a former Chief of the Defence Staff, the highest military rank in the United Kingdom. He was not a fringe figure. He was the man who had commanded Britain's armed forces. And in 2001, he was asking the government pointed questions about UFO incidents on the record in Parliament. On page 11 of this file, Lord Hill Norton asks, and I am reading directly from the parliamentary record, he asks, why RAF Watton was able to confirm in writing to a member of the public in 1989 that it had a record of an unidentified flying object report over RAF-Bentwaters, timed at 3:25 a.m. on 28 December 1980. That is the 1980 Rendlesham Forest incident, a separate case, but one that shares geography with Lakenheath. Hill Norton is using a paper trail from 1989 to challenge the government's claim that radar data from UFO incidents was not retained.
Okay, let me make sure I understand what's happening here. You have a former Chief of the Defence Staff, the top military officer in Britain, standing up in the House of Lords in 2001 and essentially saying, you told us the radar records don't exist. But here is a letter from 1989 from an RAF station that proves they did exist. He is catching the government in a contradiction, using their own paperwork against them.
What strikes me about this is the institutional weight behind it. Hill Norton spent his career inside these systems. He knows how radar data is logged, how long records are supposed to be retained, and what the chain of custody looks like. When someone at that level starts asking these questions in a formal parliamentary setting, it is not the behavior of someone chasing a conspiracy theory. It is the behavior of someone who believes the official record does not match the operational record, and who has enough standing to demand an answer.
And what did the government actually say in response? Because I'm guessing they didn't just hand over the radar tapes and say, you caught us.
The response, from Lord Falconer of Thoroton on page 8, references an Army Headquarters Northern Ireland letter and directs Hill Norton to a public inquiry group, which is the government's way of saying, we have answered this elsewhere. It is a deflection dressed as a response. But the significance of this document is not what the government said back. It is what Hill Norton's question proves, that as late as 1989, RAF Watton had written confirmation of a UFO radar record from 1980. The data existed. The question of what happened to it after that is one the MOD has never fully answered.
So this document is less about getting answers and more about proving the right questions were being asked. At the highest levels, by the most credentialed people possible.
Precisely. And it establishes something important for this episode. The British military establishment was not uniformly dismissive of this phenomenon. When the most senior defense official in the country's history devotes parliamentary time to radar data retention on UFO incidents, that tells you something about how seriously at least some insiders took the question.
It also tells you something about the data itself. If these were obviously explainable, temperature inversions, weather balloons, misidentified aircraft, a man like Hill Norton would not spend political capital pursuing them into his retirement. He had access to classified briefings throughout his career. Whatever he knew or suspected, it was enough to make him keep pushing. That context matters when we start reading the actual radar reports from 1956.
All right, so we have the frame, a senior military figure demanding answers, the government deflecting, and a paper trail proving radar records existed. Now let's go to the document that, for me, is the most quietly devastating thing in this entire episode. Because this one goes all the way to the Prime Minister.
The second document is UK MOD file DEFI 24-2057-1. This is an unclassified MOD correspondence file covering the years 2000 and 2001, 252 pages in total. It documents an exchange between the MOD and a researcher who was trying to locate a specific classified report, DSI JTIC Report Number 7, titled Unidentified Flying Objects, produced in 1952. DSI stands for Directorate of Scientific Intelligence. JTIC is the Joint Technical Intelligence Committee. These were not fringe operations. These were the core intelligence analysis bodies of the British government. And in 1952, they produced an official report on UFOs. On page 48 of this file, the MOD formally states, and I am reading directly, that DSI JTIC Report Number 7, Unidentified Flying Objects, 1952, quote, "We conclude it has not survived the passage of time. They are saying the report is lost, gone." But then on page 50, the same file includes this observation, quote, "It seems improbable that such an important document," and this is the key phrase, "the basis of a briefing by the Secretary of State for Air to Prime Minister Winston Churchill in 1952 would have been lost." That is the MOD's own language. They are calling their own conclusion improbable.
Wait, hold on. The MOD is saying the report is lost, and then in the same document they are saying it seems improbable that it's lost. They are contradicting themselves on the same page. And the reason it seems improbable is because this report went all the way to Winston Churchill. Churchill was personally briefed on UFOs by the Secretary of State for Air.
The Churchill connection is significant for a specific reason. By 1952, Churchill had been Prime Minister twice, he had run a world war, and he was surrounded by some of the finest scientific minds Britain had ever assembled. He was not a credulous man. If the Secretary of State for Air considered the DSI JTIC report important enough to brief the Prime Minister personally, it means the report contained something that the senior civilian leadership believed Churchill needed to know about. You do not waste a Prime Minister's time on weather balloons.
So what was in it? If the report is lost, do we know anything about what it concluded?
We know fragments, and this is where page 40 of the same file becomes critical. The MOD correspondence notes, and I am quoting directly, "The two short passages deleted from the DSI JTIC Report Number 7 were the subject of discussions between the MOD and the relevant party, presumably the U.S. Air Force." This was written in the year 2000, nearly 50 years after the report was produced. Two passages were still redacted, still classified, still the subject of active coordination between British and American intelligence. Whatever those passages said, both governments agreed in the year 2000 that the public should not read them.
That is extraordinary. 50 years later, the US Air Force is still involved in deciding what the British public can know about a British UFO report from 1952. That is not routine document management. That is active, ongoing classification of something both governments consider sensitive enough to protect across half a century.
From a scientific standpoint, what interests me about this is the institutional response it implies. A joint British-American intelligence report on UFOs, produced in 1952, briefed to the Prime Minister, with specific passages still classified 50 years later. That is not the paper trail of a phenomenon that was being dismissed. Dismissal does not require that level of sustained coordination. Sustained coordination implies sustained concern.
And there is one more layer to this document. The MOD notes that the report was actually recovered once, in 1967, before being lost again. So it existed, it was in the archive, and then it disappeared. The file on page 48 confirms that recovery, which makes the subsequent loss even harder to explain as simple administrative error.
Okay, I need a second with that. We have a report that was important enough to brief Churchill. It was lost. Then it was found in 1967. Then it was lost again. And the parts that were visible had passages still being coordinated with the US Air Force in the year 2000. I don't know what to do with that except say, that is not how you treat an embarrassing weather balloon report.
No, it is not. And I think it is worth stepping back for a moment and recognizing what these first two documents together are telling us. We have a former chief of the defense staff demanding answers about radar records that the government says do not exist, but that he can prove did exist. And we have a classified intelligence report, produced at the highest level of British scientific intelligence, briefed to the Prime Minister, with redactions still being managed 50 years later in coordination with the Americans. These are not the behaviors of governments that have solved the problem and filed it away. These are the behaviors of governments that are still managing something they do not fully understand.
And that brings us to the third document. Because if the British and American governments were managing this together, if there was active transatlantic coordination on UFO intelligence, it raises a question. Were other major powers seeing the same thing? Were their military radar systems tracking the same kind of anomalies?
The third document is CIA File 05516731. This is a one-page confidential CIA summary dated 22nd of November 1990. It is a summary of Soviet press clippings. The CIA routinely monitored foreign media for intelligence value, and this document represents that function. The report is brief, but what it contains is specific and striking. It summarizes a report from a Soviet newspaper called Selskaya Zhizn, which translates roughly as rural life, citing a local officer's account of events on 15th of November 1990 in Amur Oblast, which is a region in the Russian Far East, near the Chinese border. On page 1, the document states, and I'm reading the CIA's own summary language exactly, quote, Korotkov report citing local officers' disclosure of radar sightings of UFOs around time of 15 November, rogue launch of surface-to-air missiles in Amur Oblast. That is the entire entry. But unpack it. A local military officer disclosed that radar systems detected UFOs at the same time that surface-to-air missiles launched without authorization. The CIA flagged this and processed it for further analysis. That notation, PIL for UD processing, means it was routed for additional intelligence review.
So what you're saying is, in 1990, in the Soviet Union, military radar picked up UFOs, and at the same moment, surface-to-air missiles fired on their own, without anyone ordering them to. And the CIA was reading about this in a newspaper and decided it was worth routing for intelligence review.
The phrase rogue launch is the detail I cannot put aside. Surface-to-air missiles do not launch themselves. There are multiple interlocks, safety systems, command authorizations required. A rogue launch, meaning a launch that was not commanded, is an extraordinarily serious event from a technical standpoint. It implies either catastrophic system failure or some external stimulus that triggered the launch systems. The fact that radar UFO detections coincided with that event is the kind of correlation that any serious engineer would want to investigate. Whether it is causal or coincidental, you cannot simply ignore it.
And this is the CIA flagging it in 1990 at the tail end of the Cold War. They are reading Soviet newspapers and pulling out a story about military radar UFO detections and unauthorized missile launches and saying, this goes into the intelligence processing pipeline. That is not nothing.
It is not, and the significance extends beyond the specific incident. This document is evidence that the CIA was actively monitoring Soviet reports of military radar UFO detections as late as 1990. That means the intelligence collection apparatus of the United States considered foreign military UFO radar data to be intelligence-relevant information, worth collecting, worth processing, worth filing. That is a policy decision. Someone decided this category of information mattered.
And it connects to the transatlantic coordination we saw in the DEFI 24-2057 document. The British-American discussions about the 1952 report. By 1990, the Cold War context has shifted, but the pattern is the same. Multiple governments, multiple military organizations, all tracking the same category of anomalous radar events, all treating them as worth serious institutional attention. That is a global pattern, not a British eccentricity or an American fixation.
Right. And it sets up the question I keep coming back to. If this was happening in England in 1956 and in the Soviet Union in 1990, is it still happening now? Because we've been talking about Cold War archives and parliamentary correspondence from 2001, but radar is still running, pilots are still flying, air traffic control is still watching the screens.
Which brings us to the fourth document, and this one is not from 1956 or 1952 or 1990. This is from August 2023. FAA Skywatch Incident Report 237 UAP00287. This is an unclassified Federal Aviation Administration Operations Report, 1 page, filed on 12 August 2023. Skywatch is the FAA's system for logging unusual aerial events reported by pilots and air traffic controllers. This report documents an encounter near Florence, South Carolina, approximately 30 nautical miles southwest of Florence Regional Airport. On page 1, the report states, and I am reading the exact operational language, quote, "Aircraft reported an unidentified aerial phenomenon off the R side while northbound at 20,000 feet, at 3425 north, 80.09 west, 30 nautical miles southwest of Florence." The unknown phenomenon was described as 3 circling lights maneuvering at 40,000 feet. ZJX did receive a primary radar target at the latitude-longitude location. ZJX is the FAA identifier for Jacksonville Air Route Traffic Control Center, which covers that airspace. The pilot saw it visually, the radar saw it independently, at the same location, at the same time.
Okay, so a commercial Boeing 737 pilot is flying northbound at 20,000 feet. Off his right side, he sees 3 lights circling at 40,000 feet. That's 20,000 feet above him. He reports it to air traffic control, and Jacksonville Center confirms, yes, we have a primary radar target at exactly that location. Not a transponder return, not a squawk code, a primary return. A physical object bouncing radar energy back at the antenna, and nobody knows what it is.
The distinction between a primary radar return and a transponder return is important here. Every commercial aircraft carries a transponder, a device that actively broadcasts the aircraft's identity, altitude, and position when interrogated by radar. A primary return is different. It is the radar detecting a physical object by the reflection of its own signal. No cooperation from the object required. When Jacksonville Center reports a primary radar target at that location, they are saying the radar hit something real and solid, something with physical presence. The visual report and the primary return are 2 completely independent data streams pointing at the same thing.
And this is happening in 2023, not 1956, not during the Cold War. Right now, in modern airspace, with modern radar, a commercial airline pilot sees something, and the air traffic control radar confirms it, and it goes into the FAA's Skywatch system as an unidentified aerial phenomenon. The exact same combination of evidence that made Lakenheath significant in 1956 is still showing up in the data today.
That is the through line this document establishes. The FAA Skywatch system was created precisely because these reports kept coming in and there was no standardized way to capture them. The fact that this 2023 report uses the same core evidentiary framework, visual confirmation plus independent radar corroboration, as the 1956 Lakenheath case is not a coincidence. It reflects the fact that the phenomenon, whatever it is, has not changed. The reporting systems have gotten better. The documentation has become more rigorous, but the underlying pattern of observation remains remarkably consistent across 7 decades.
What I find scientifically compelling about the Florence 2023 case is the altitude differential. The pilot is at 20,000 feet. The phenomenon is at 40,000 feet. That is a significant vertical separation, roughly 4 miles of clear air between the observer and the object. At that distance, atmospheric distortion is minimal, The viewing angle is good, and the geometry of the observation is relatively clean. When a pilot at 20,000 feet describes 3 circling lights at 40,000 feet, and air traffic control independently confirms a primary radar return at that location, you have a genuinely difficult observational scenario to dismiss.
And the behavior, 3 circling lights maneuvering, not a straight-line track, not a weather balloon drifting on the wind, circling. That is controlled motion. That is something directing itself.
The operational language in the report is precise on that point. Maneuvering is a specific term in aviation. It implies directed, controlled movement. Air traffic controllers and pilots do not use that word casually. When a Skywatch report uses maneuvering to describe an unidentified object, it is the trained observer's assessment that what they are seeing is not passive or ballistic. It is actively changing position. That assessment, combined with the primary radar return, is exactly the evidentiary combination the 1956 investigators at Lakenheath said was the most convincing possible.
Which takes us back to the quote we opened this episode with. The fact that they were seen visually and by radar is the most convincing combination of evidence. That was written about 1956, and here we are in 2023, and we are reading a Skywatch report that is the same combination, in the same configuration, filed into the same kind of official system. The technology has changed, the documentation has changed, the phenomenon has not.
And that consistency across time is itself a data point. If this were a systematic error in human perception, we would expect the nature of the reports to shift as cultural references and technological expectations shift. If this were a systematic radar artifact, we would expect modern digital radar to have eliminated it. Neither of those things has happened. The reports keep coming in. They keep showing the same core characteristics, and they keep resisting the easy explanations. That does not tell us what the phenomenon is, but it tells us that whatever it is real enough and consistent enough to keep showing up in official records across 7 decades.
So let's take stock of where we are. We have a former chief of the defense staff, the highest military officer in Britain, demanding answers about radar records that the government says don't exist, but that he can prove did exist. We have a classified 1952 British intelligence report, briefed to Winston Churchill himself, that went missing, was found, went missing again, and still had passages being coordinated with the US Air Force 50 years later. We have a 1990 CIA document showing Soviet military radar detecting UFOs at the same moment surface-to-air missiles launched without authorization. And we have a 2023 FAA report of a commercial pilot seeing 3 maneuvering lights at 40,000 feet, independently confirmed by air traffic control radar. That is 4 documents spanning 70 years from 3 different countries, all pointing at the same evidentiary pattern.
And we have not yet reached the document that changes the shape of everything we have just discussed. The one that forces the question of whether the official story, the one the British government told the public about how seriously it took this phenomenon, was already broken by the data 4 years before Lakenheath even happened.
I will say this. As a physicist, I came into this expecting to spend most of my time explaining away the easy cases. Temperature inversions, radar artifacts, misidentified aircraft, those explanations are real, and they apply to a significant portion of UFO reports. But the cases we have been walking through today are not the easy ones. They are the ones where the standard explanations have already been considered and set aside by the people who were there, with the equipment in front of them, in real time. That is the category of case that I think deserves genuine scientific attention. Not because I know what the answer is, I do not, but because the data is genuinely anomalous, and the witnesses are genuinely qualified.
And that, I think, is exactly where we need to go next, because there is a document in this file that the British government produced in 1952, the same year they were briefing Churchill, that reached a very definitive conclusion about what UFOs were. And then Lakenheath happened, and everything that document said got very, very complicated. Okay, so let's take stock of where we are. We've got the Lakenheath radar data. We've got the Condon report's own investigators admitting this case is unexplained, And we've got a pattern emerging across decades. But I want to push on something, because a skeptic listening right now is going to say, okay, 1956 is a long time ago. Equipment was different. People made mistakes. What does the modern record look like? Are we still getting the same kind of corroborated multi-source reports? Dr. Walsh, what's your read on that?
That's exactly the right question to ask. And honestly, it's the one I kept coming back to when I started looking at this material seriously. Because if the Lakenheath case were truly an artifact of 1950s technology, faulty radar, undertrained operators, Cold War nerves, then you would expect the modern record to look cleaner. Better sensors, better training, better communication systems, and yet what we actually see in the contemporary FAA reporting database is a pattern that rhymes with Lakenheath in some very uncomfortable ways. Same core features, trained observers, corroboration across multiple aircraft, and these persistent, baffling discrepancies between what eyes see and what radar confirms.
The first modern document I want to look at is an FAA Skywatch incident report dated February 10th, 2019. It is a single-page, unclassified, filed through the FAA's Standard Aviation Safety Reporting Channel. The location is over the Pacific Northwest, coordinates 42 degrees, 47 minutes north, 121 degrees, 42 minutes west, which places this roughly over south-central Oregon. A commercial Boeing 737 was southbound at flight level 350, that is 35,000 feet, when the pilot in command filed the report. On page 1 it states, PIC reported a UFO while S-bound at FL 350. UFO had a white flashing light, slow-moving, estimated at FL 400, FL 500 NE bound. Lat long, 42, 47N, 121, 40 UW. ZSE CPC observed a primary target in the vicinity showing 20 knots.
Let me make sure I'm reading that right. A commercial airline pilot reports something above him, between 40,000 and 50,000 feet, moving slowly with a white flashing light. And then the FAA's own radar controller, the ZSE CPC, that's the Center Position Controller at Seattle Center, they actually pick up a primary radar return in the same area, moving at 20 knots. So this isn't just a pilot looking out a window and seeing something strange. The radar saw it too.
Right, and the 20 knots detail is what makes this technically interesting. At those altitudes, 40,000 to 50,000 feet, you are above virtually all commercial traffic. The wind speeds up there can be significant, but a sustained 20-knot primary radar return that corresponds to a visual sighting is not a weather artifact. Weather returns on radar look different. They're diffuse. They move with the wind pattern. A discrete primary target at 20 knots is a solid reflective object. Now, 20 knots is extraordinarily slow for anything operating at that altitude. Most aircraft at FL 400 are doing 400 to 500 knots, so whatever this was, it was essentially hovering relative to normal traffic.
And that's 2019, not 1956. Modern radar, modern aircraft, modern trained pilots with every incentive not to file a weird report. This is someone who has to keep their FAA certification, who knows their report goes into an official database, and they still filed it because they saw something they couldn't explain.
That is an important point about the institutional context of these reports. FAA Skywatch filings are not anonymous tip lines. The pilot in command is identified, the flight is logged, the time is stamped. There is a professional cost to filing a report that cannot be explained, and yet these reports continue to come in consistently across different carriers, different regions, different weather conditions. The 2019 Oregon case is notable precisely because the radar corroboration came from ZSE, Seattle Center, which is one of the busiest and most technically sophisticated en route control facilities in the country. These are not inexperienced operators.
The thing I keep returning to with cases like this is what I'd call the corroboration asymmetry problem. When you have a pilot visual and a radar return that agree, same location, same time, consistent behavior, that is actually the easier case to analyze, even if the object is unexplained. The harder cases, The ones that genuinely challenge my framework as a physicist are the ones where the visual and the radar disagree, where pilots see something clearly and radar shows nothing, or vice versa. Because then you have to ask, which instrument is telling you the truth? And the answer is not always obvious.
Which is a perfect segue, because the next document on our list is exactly that kind of case. And honestly, when I read this one, I had to go back and read it twice.
This is an FAA Skywatch report dated December 28, 2023, just over a year ago as of this recording. It documents an encounter involving a Southwest Airlines flight, call sign SWA-1508, near Shreveport, Louisiana. The aircraft was westbound at flight level 310, which is 31,000 feet, approximately 1 nautical mile west of Shreveport Regional Airport. Page 1 of the report states, aircraft reported an unidentified aerial phenomenon off the above them, while W-bound at FL 310, 1 nmW of SHV. The unknown phenomenon was orbiting at approximately FL 410, and then, critically, report validated by ENY 37A81. That is an Envoy Air regional jet that independently confirmed the sighting. And then this. The UAP was not displayed on ATC facility radar system.
So you've got two commercial airliners, Southwest and Envoy, both looking at the same thing, orbiting 10,000 feet above them at 41,000 feet. Two crews, two aircraft, two independent sets of trained eyes, all describing the same phenomenon in the same location at the same time. And air traffic control radar, the same system that tracks every commercial flight in that airspace, shows absolutely nothing. How is that possible?
So this is where I have to be really careful about how I explain this, because there are mundane explanations for radar invisibility that I should put on the table honestly. Some objects genuinely do have very low radar cross-sections, that is, they reflect very little radar energy back to the receiver. Stealth technology works on this principle. Certain weather balloons, certain drone configurations, even some birds in formation can produce minimal radar returns. So radar invisibility alone is not proof of something exotic. But, and this is a significant but, when you combine radar invisibility with two independent visual confirmations of a structured object exhibiting controlled flight behavior, specifically orbiting, then you've eliminated the most common mundane explanations. A balloon doesn't orbit. A bird doesn't orbit at 41,000 feet.
The word orbiting in the report is significant. It implies a deliberate, repeating flight path, a circle or loop maintained over a fixed point. That is controlled flight behavior. It is not consistent with a balloon drifting on wind currents, and it is not consistent with a meteor or other transient phenomenon. Two separate flight crews used the same or equivalent language to describe what they observed, which is what triggered the secondary validation note in the report.
You're kidding me. So the FAA report actually has a formal validation field where a second aircraft confirms the first sighting. This isn't just one pilot calling it in and someone else happening to mention it later. There's a structured process here.
That's actually one of the things that makes the modern FAA dataset more rigorous than a lot of people realize. These aren't informal anecdotes. There are procedures. When a second crew independently corroborates a report, it gets flagged in the system. The fact that ENY 3781's confirmation made it into the official record means someone at the facility recognized the significance and documented it properly. That's the system working as intended, which makes the radar null result even more puzzling, not less.
So we've got the 2019 Oregon case, where radar and visual agree, and the 2023 Shreveport case, where visual and visual agree, but radar shows nothing. Two different kinds of mystery. Let me take a breath here, because I think it's worth just sitting with that for a second. We have trained professionals in modern aircraft, with modern instruments, filing official reports through federal systems, and the data still doesn't resolve cleanly into any known category.
And that's what makes this so genuinely difficult to dismiss. I came into this research with every expectation of finding prosaic explanations for most of these cases. And for a significant portion of them, I did find prosaic explanations. Starlink trains, high-altitude balloons, misidentified aircraft at unusual angles, but there's a residual that doesn't fit. And the Shreveport case is in that residual. 2 crews, controlled flight behavior, 0 radar return. I don't have a clean answer for that.
The third modern document moves from radar invisibility to something even more visually dramatic. This is an FAA Skywatch report dated March 16, 2024. Multiple aircraft were operating in the vicinity of the JCTVOR, Junction, Texas, when the reports came in. Page 1 states, multiple aircraft in the vicinity of JCTVOR reported an unidentified aerial phenomenon believed to be some type of rocket. The device passed from below to above and then appeared to break up into pieces and/or disappear. The device was very bright and had smoke. Report was at 36,000 feet, and device was moving west to east. The UAP was not observed on ATC facility radar system. NORAD notified.
NORAD was notified. That is not a line you put in a routine aviation report. NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, that's the organization whose entire job is tracking things in the airspace over North America. If the FAA is picking up the phone and calling NORAD about a sighting over Texas at 36,000 feet, that tells you something about how seriously the people in that facility were taking what the pilots were describing.
The rocket description with smoke and apparent breakup is interesting from a physics standpoint. It's not inconsistent with a re-entering space debris event or a high-altitude rocket test, both of which can produce exactly that visual signature. Bright object, smoke trail, apparent fragmentation. Those are things I'd want to rule out first. But here's the problem. The report says no radar return. If you have a bright, smoke-emitting object large enough to be seen by multiple commercial aircraft at 36,000 feet, it should have a radar cross-section. Space debris re-entry typically lights up radar. The absence of a radar track for something that visually prominent is anomalous.
The NORAD notification also indicates the incident triggered a formal military response protocol. ZHU, that is Houston Center, filed a mandatory occurrence report and conducted a Falcon replay, which is a recorded radar playback review. The case was then closed. But the closure does not mean an explanation was found. The report does not identify the object. It documents the event, the response, and the null radar result, and then closes the file. That is the bureaucratic record of something that remains unexplained.
That last detail, case closed without an explanation. That's the part that gets under my skin. Because closed sounds like resolved. But what it actually means here is, we documented it, we couldn't identify it, we moved on. Those are very different things.
And that's a systemic issue that goes beyond any individual case. The FAA's mandate is aviation safety, not UAP investigation. Once they've determined there's no immediate threat to air traffic, the institutional pressure is to close the file and move on. There's no dedicated analytical unit tasked with going back through the Skywatch database, pulling the cases with null radar returns and multi-witness corroboration, and asking what the pattern means. That analytical layer doesn't exist in any systematic way, which is why you can have hundreds of these reports and still have no coherent picture of what's happening.
So we've got 3 modern cases, 2019, 2023, 2024, each with their own version of the same fundamental puzzle, and all of them are echoing in their own way the same questions that came up at Lakenheath in 1956. Now, I want to go back to the British side of this, because there's one more document in our file that I think ties a lot of this together. Echo, what have you got?
This is a UK Ministry of Defence administrative file, reference DEF 24 2028-11. It is a 193-page file covering the MOD's handling of a parliamentary ombudsman complaint related to UFO and UAP disclosures, specifically the process of searching, sanitizing, and releasing historical files. Within this file, there is correspondence advocating for transparency on specific historical cases. On page 10, in the context of a discussion about the 1957 West Frog radar incident, a separate case involving multiple radar stations in Scotland tracking an unidentified object. The document states, applying Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is that this was clearly a case of an unidentified craft with design and performance characteristics well in excess of the then state-of-the-art technology.
Hold on, Occam's razor. That's the principle that says the simplest explanation is usually the right one, and someone inside the Ministry of Defense is applying that principle and concluding, the simplest explanation is an unidentified craft with capabilities beyond anything we had. Not it was probably a weather balloon. Not the radar operators were confused. The simplest explanation, according to this internal document, is advanced unknown technology. That is a remarkable thing for a government document to say.
The use of Occam's razor in this context is fascinating to me as a scientist because it's usually deployed in the opposite direction, to argue for the mundane explanation over the exotic one. The implicit logic is usually, UFO requires extraordinary assumptions. Conventional explanation requires fewer assumptions. Therefore, conventional explanation wins. But what this document is saying is that, in the Westfroy case, the data was so anomalous, the performance so far outside known parameters, that invoking conventional explanations actually required more assumptions than simply accepting the data at face value. That is a significant epistemic position for a government analyst to put in writing.
The document also reveals the institutional cost of taking these cases seriously. Page 6 notes, Ombudsman case, total time taken to search, copy, sanitize, copy, and produce a summary, 8 hours, 40 minutes. This is the administrative record of a government trying to manage disclosure of historical UFO files under parliamentary oversight. Someone filed a formal complaint with the Parliamentary Ombudsman, the UK's independent watchdog for government maladministration, specifically over how UFO-related files were being handled. The MOD was compelled to respond, to search its records, to sanitize what could not be released, and to account for the time spent doing so.
So the British public was pushing hard enough for answers that someone went to the Parliamentary Ombudsman, and the MOD had to spend nearly 9 hours just processing one complaint about these files. That's not a fringe concern. That's institutional pressure generating a formal government response.
What strikes me about this document in the context of everything we've discussed today is the phrase, well in excess of the then state-of-the-art technology. That qualifier, then, is doing a lot of work. It's an acknowledgement that in 1957, when the Westfroy incident occurred, what was observed exceeded what was technically possible. And the document was written years later, with the benefit of hindsight, and the author still concluded that the simplest explanation was an unidentified advanced craft. That's not a hot take in the moment. That's a considered, retrospective analytical judgment.
And it connects directly back to Lakenheath, because what we've been building toward all episode, the radar tracks, the fighter intercepts, the visual confirmations, the impossible maneuvers, all of that points to the same conclusion this MOD analyst reached about Westfroy. The data, taken at face value, describes something that shouldn't exist. Which brings me to where I think we need to land. Because there's one more document, and Echo told me before we started recording that this one changes the whole picture.
There is one more document, and it does change everything we have discussed today, not because it contradicts the evidence, but because it reveals the institutional framework that existed before Lakenheath happened. And once you understand that framework, the significance of what occurred on the night of August 13, 1956, becomes something far more profound than a single unexplained radar event. This is UK Ministry of Defence document reference DEF 24-2057-1.
We've referenced this document earlier in the episode, but we've been holding the full picture back. What is it exactly?
DEF 24-2057-1 contains the findings of the Flying Saucer Working Party, a secret committee established by the British government in 1951 and reporting directly to the Cabinet's Joint Intelligence Committee. This was not a fringe exercise. The Joint Intelligence Committee is the apex of British intelligence assessment, the body that coordinates intelligence from MI5, MI6, GCHQ, and military intelligence, and reports to the Prime Minister. The Flying Saucer Working Party was asked to assess the UFO phenomenon at the highest levels of government. Their report was completed in 1952, 4 years before Lakenheath, and their conclusion was unambiguous.
I want to make sure listeners understand what that institutional context means. This wasn't a group of enthusiasts or junior analysts. The Joint Intelligence Committee in 1952 was staffed by the people who had just run British intelligence through the Second World War. These were experienced, rigorous analysts who had spent years evaluating deception, propaganda, and enemy capabilities. When they convened a working party on flying saucers, they brought that same framework to bear. And their conclusion, whatever it was, carried the full weight of British intelligence authority.
Their conclusion, as documented in Def 24-2057-1, was that UFO reports were almost certainly the result of misidentification, optical illusion, psychological delusion, or deliberate hoax. The Working Party recommended that no further resources be allocated to UFO investigation, that the topic not be given official credence, and that reports be discouraged rather than encouraged. This was the official position of British intelligence, signed off at the highest level, 4 years before Lakenheath.
So let me get this straight. In 1952, the most senior intelligence body in Britain looked at the UFO question and said, "This is misidentification and delusion. Stop wasting time on it." That is the official, classified, top-secret conclusion. And then 4 years later, in August 1956, what happens?
In August 1956, multiple RAF and USAF radar stations simultaneously track an object performing maneuvers inconsistent with any known aircraft. Fighter jets are scrambled. A de Havilland Venom makes visual contact. The object locks onto the fighter's tail and follows it through evasive maneuvers. The encounter lasts over 5 hours. Multiple independent radar systems confirm the same tracks. The Condon Report's own investigators, reviewing the case over a decade later, conclude it is the most puzzling and unusual case in the radar visual files. The official position, the 1952 conclusion that this was all misidentification and delusion, was not just challenged by Lakenheath, it was broken by it.
This is what scientists call a paradigm-breaking result. You have a formal, authoritative prior conclusion. UFOs are explicable phenomena. And then you have a data set that cannot be accommodated within that conclusion. The scientifically correct response is to revise the conclusion. But institutions don't work like scientific papers. You can't just issue a revision to a Joint Intelligence Committee report and distribute it to everyone who received the original. The official position persists even when the data has outrun it. And that gap between what the data shows and what the official position says is where Lakenheath lives.
So the British government had already officially decided this wasn't real. And then it happened anyway, right over their own military bases, tracked by their own radar, chased by their own pilots, and the official conclusion from 1952 just sat there, unchanged, while the evidence was piling up on the other side.
What the documents show is that the Lakenheath incident did force a quiet internal reevaluation. The MOD did not publicly revise the 1952 conclusions. But internally, the case generated exactly the kind of sustained attention that the Flying Saucer Working Party had recommended against. Files were kept. Reports were cross-referenced. And decades later, when those files were eventually released, the internal correspondence revealed that analysts within the system knew Lakenheath was different, knew it did not fit the framework they had been given. The document we read earlier, applying Occam's razor and concluding the simplest explanation, was an advanced, unidentified craft. That document exists because Lakenheath and cases like it made the 1952 position intellectually untenable.
And this is why I think the Lakenheath case matters beyond its own details. It's not just, here is a strange thing that happened over England in 1956. It's evidence of a structural failure in how institutions handle paradigm-breaking data. The 1952 report set a conclusion. The 1956 data contradicted it. The institution couldn't publicly revise its position, so the contradiction was managed quietly, internally, over decades. And the public, and frankly, the scientific community, was left with the official position rather than the actual data. That pattern is what I find most troubling.
The official story said, "This isn't real, stop looking." And the data said, "It happened anyway." And for decades, the official story won, not because the evidence supported it, but because the institution couldn't admit it had been wrong. That is the real story of Lakenheath, not just the radar tracks and the fighter chase. The gap between what they knew and what they said.
That gap is precisely what the declassified record documents, and it is why the document trail matters. Not because any single file proves something extraordinary, but because the pattern across the files, the 1952 conclusion, the 1956 incident, the internal reevaluations, the ombudsman complaints, the modern FAA reports still generating NORAD notifications, that pattern tells a story that the official record on its own does not.
I'll say this as someone who came into this work as a skeptic, and remains one. The Lakenheath case is the case I would show to any scientist who dismisses this topic as not worth serious attention. Not because it proves anything exotic, but because it demonstrates that the data, rigorously examined, does not resolve into the official explanation. And in science, when the data doesn't fit the model, you don't dismiss the data. You revise the model. That hasn't happened here. And that's a problem.
Lakenheath proved something. Multiple radar systems, multiple visual confirmations, military jets scrambled, a 5-hour encounter, and the best explanation the scientific establishment could officially offer was anomalous propagation and atmospheric effects. The data said otherwise, and the data is still there in those files, waiting.
Lakenheath proved the technology could track them. The radar locked on. The pilots made visual contact. The encounter was documented in real time by multiple independent systems. But the encounter lasted hours, and the object was moving at extreme speeds, appearing and disappearing from radar, never allowing a sustained close look. The question that Lakenheath leaves open is this: has anyone ever gotten truly close to one of these things? Not a radar blip, not a distant light. Close enough to describe it in detail for an extended period of time, with nowhere to go and nothing to do but watch.
As it turns out, yes. Next time we climb into the cockpit of a Japan Airlines Boeing 747 on a cargo flight over Alaska. The crew will spend nearly 50 minutes alongside something they describe as a massive structured craft, something so large it dwarfs their aircraft. The encounter will be recorded, reported, investigated by the FAA and the Air Force, and then quietly buried. The Alaskan mothership. That's next time. And trust me, after Lakenheath, you are not ready for what those pilots saw. Okay, let me just sit with this for a second, because I think we need to step back from the documents and say out loud what we've actually established tonight. We started this episode with a quote about visual and radar confirmation being the most convincing combination of evidence. And then we spent the last hour proving, document by document, that on the night of August 13, 1956, over the English countryside, that combination existed. Multiple radar stations, multiple trained military observers, fighter pilots in the air who saw it with their own eyes, and an object that didn't just appear, it maneuvered, it reacted. It turned the tables on a jet that was chasing it.
From a physics standpoint, what makes Lakenheath so difficult to dismiss is exactly that convergence. Any single element, a radar return, a visual sighting, a pilot report, can be explained away in isolation. Anomalous propagation, optical illusion, fatigue, misidentification. These are legitimate explanations that I would normally reach for first. But when you have ground radar, airborne radar, and multiple trained human observers all confirming the same object, at the same time performing the same maneuvers, the probability that all of those independent systems failed in the same way, at the same moment, drops to something very close to zero. That's not belief. That's statistics.
What the paper trail tells us is this: the British government knew Lakenheath was different. The Flying Saucer Working Party report from 1952, the one prepared for Churchill's government, had already drawn its conclusions. Misidentification, delusion, natural phenomena, case closed. But the files from 1956 show that those conclusions did not survive contact with the Lakenheath data. The internal evaluations became more careful. The language became more qualified. The dismissals stopped coming as quickly. The documents do not announce a reversal. That is not how governments operate. But the shift is visible in the texture of the bureaucratic response.
And that's what gets me. It's not that someone stood up and said, "We were wrong." Nobody did that. What you see instead is this quiet, institutional retreat from certainty. The confident dismissals of 1952 give way to more cautious language, to longer evaluations, to files that stay open longer than they should if the answer were really just weather balloon. That's an organization that encountered something it couldn't explain and chose to deal with it by saying less rather than more, which honestly might be more unsettling than a cover-up. A cover-up implies someone knows the answer. This looks more like no one does.
I want to add something to that, because I think it's important. The Condon Committee, the University of Colorado study that officially closed the book on UFO research for the U.S. government in 1969, reviewed the Lakenheath case and called it, in their own report, one of the most puzzling and unusual cases in the radar visual files. Their conclusion was that the probability that at least one genuine UFO was involved appeared to be fairly high. That is a scientific review committee commissioned by the Air Force using the phrase genuine UFO and calling the probability fairly high. That sentence was in the report that was used to justify shutting down official investigation. Let that land.
A scientific committee says the probability of a genuine UFO is fairly high, and the government uses that same report to justify stopping all official investigation. I mean, you genuinely cannot make that up.
The frustration is legitimate. The Condon report ran to nearly 1,000 pages. The conclusions in the summary, the part that policymakers read, the part that got reported in the press, did not reflect what the case analyses inside the report actually said. Lakenheath was buried in the middle. The working party dismissal was the headline. The data was always there for anyone willing to read to page 400 and something. Most people did not. Most people still have not. That is not a conspiracy. That is how institutional knowledge disappears, not through malice, but through the simple human tendency to read the summary and stop.
So what we're left with, after all of this, after the radar tapes and the scrambled jets and the Churchill memo and the working party reversal, is a case that the people closest to it called unexplained, that a scientific review called probably real, and that was then filed away under a headline that said the opposite. And the files sat in archives for decades until someone filed the right FOIA request and actually read them. That's the Lakenheath story, not a cover-up. A filing cabinet.
What I take away from tonight, and I say this as someone who has spent a career demanding rigorous evidence before drawing conclusions, is that Lakenheath is the case that earns the phrase unexplained. Not unexplained because we didn't try hard enough. Unexplained because the people who were there, with the best equipment available to them, applying their full professional competence, arrived at a genuine unknown. That deserves more than a filing cabinet. It deserves the kind of sustained scientific attention we give to any other anomaly that challenges our understanding of what's possible.
Lakenheath proved something specific, and it matters for where this series is going. It proved that the technology existed, ground radar, airborne radar, trained human observers, to detect, track, and confirm these objects under rigorous conditions. The data was real. The chain of custody was intact. The witnesses were credible. What Lakenheath could not do was give us time. The encounter lasted minutes. The object was at extreme speed and altitude. Everyone who saw it briefly in the dark, from a distance, at the edge of what their instruments could resolve.
Right. And that's the thing that keeps nagging at me. Every case we've looked at in this series, the Washington radar returns, the Lakenheath intercept, they're all these flashes. Something appears, something happens, something disappears. Nobody gets a long look, nobody gets sustained contact. Which makes me wonder, has that ever happened? Has anyone ever been close to one of these things for long enough to really see it?
There is one case in the declassified record that answers that question directly. It is not a military intercept. It is not a ground radar return. It is a Japan Airlines 747 cargo flight over Alaska in November of 1986. The crew reported an object, and I am choosing that word carefully, not for seconds, not for minutes, but for nearly 50 minutes of sustained visual contact. The FAA opened a formal investigation. The pilot drew diagrams. The encounter was documented in real time on air traffic control recordings that still exist. The object they described was, by their own account, enormous.
50 minutes, a 747 crew, FAA investigation, real-time recordings. You're telling me there's a case where professional commercial pilots tracked something for almost an hour and it's in the official record?
It is. And what the FAA documents show is not just a sighting report. It is a system responding in real time to something it could not identify. The crew contacted Anchorage Center. Anchorage Center attempted to vector other aircraft to confirm. Military radar was checked. And the FAA's own internal investigation, which we have in the declassified files, concluded that the object was unidentified. The case became known informally as the Alaskan Mothership. Next time, we climb into that cockpit. We read the air traffic control transcripts. We look at what the FAA actually wrote when they thought no one was watching. Lakenheath proved the technology could track them. The question we have never answered is what happens when one of them decides to stay.